Captain David Carter stood in the throne room of the Kazhari Empire, surrounded by alien warriors who'd been trying to kill him until approximately 3 hours ago. His dress uniform was borrowed and didn't quite fit right. Humans and Kazhari had different ideas about appropriate formal wear, and he was acutely aware that he was the only human in a room full of beings who probably still wanted him dead. The First Contact War had lasted 18 brutal months, humanity's first encounter with an advanced alien species, and it had been violence from the start. Looking back, David understood that it had all been a catastrophic misunderstanding. The Kazhari had interpreted Earth's defensive perimeter around the Sol system as aggressive expansion. Humanity had misread their warning shots as invasion. What followed was a cascade of missed communications and cultural misunderstandings, written in blood and fire across a dozen star systems. David had been nobody special when it started. A cargo pilot, running supplies between colony stations, dreaming of exploration but stuck with logistics. Then the war began, and suddenly everyone who could fly was drafted into combat roles. He discovered he had a gift, not for violence exactly, but for seeing patterns, for understanding the shape of battle in ways that let him predict enemy movements, find elegant solutions in chaos, survive when others didn't. When the Kazhari fleet had surrounded the human defensive line at Proxima Station, David had seen what the admirals hadn't. The Kazhari formation wasn't designed for assault. It was structured for honor combat, a cultural practice humanity had no knowledge of. He'd ignored direct orders, broken formation, and challenged their fleet commander to single combat the way their own traditions demanded. The duel had lasted 4 hours. Ship against ship in the black between stars, weapons fire painting the void with light, both pilots pushing their crafts to the edge of what physics allowed. David won through a combination of skill, desperation, and the kind of luck that felt like destiny. When the Kazhari commander's ship went dark, its engines failing, the entire fleet had simply stopped. The war was over. Ancient Kazhari law, David learned afterward, held that honor combat could settle conflicts too complex for diplomacy. By defeating their commander according to their own traditions he'd intuited through pattern recognition and desperate observation, David had won not just a battle but the entire war. The Kazhari weren't defeated. They were bound by law to acknowledge his victory and grant him the victor's right. Any reward he named within reason would be his. Now he stood in Empress Vashara's throne room, about to make that request. The room was massive, all sharp angles and crystalline structures that seemed to grow from the floor like frozen lightning. Kazhari architecture favored aggressive geometries that managed to be both beautiful and vaguely threatening. Bioluminescent patterns pulsed through the walls, lighting the space with colors that hurt human eyes if you looked too long. Kazhari nobles lined the walls, tall, elegant beings with chitinous plates covering their bodies, faces that managed to be both insect-like and hauntingly beautiful, compound eyes that showed no readable emotion, antennae that twitched and angled in ways David was learning to interpret as expressions their faces couldn't convey. They watched him with barely concealed hostility. He'd ended their war, humiliated their military, and now stood here demanding payment. Empress Vashara sat on a throne of black crystal, elevated above the court. She was larger than the other Kazhari, her chitinous plates marked with intricate patterns that indicated royal bloodline. Her face was sharp and angular, inhuman but striking. Multiple compound eyes fixed on David with an intensity that made every survival instinct he possessed scream warnings. She radiated authority and danger in equal measure. Captain David Carter of the human military forces. Vashara's voice carried harmonics that the translator in David's ear struggled to render properly. You have invoked and won the right of honor combat. By the ancient laws of our people, you have earned the victor's right. She paused, and David felt the weight of her attention like physical pressure. Any reward within reason you may name, and the Kazhari Empire will honor it. Speak your desire." Her tone made it clear she hated every word of this. David understood. He'd ended her war, embarrassed her forces, and now stood in her throne room demanding compensation for defeating her. If their positions were reversed, he'd hate him too. The court waited in tense silence. David knew what humans expected him to ask for. His superiors had been very clear during the entire flight to the Kazhari homeworld. Territory, probably. Mining rights to Kazhari-controlled systems rich in rare elements Earth desperately needed. Technology transfers, access to FTL innovations that could advance humanity by decades. The smart play would be to request a formal peace treaty with favorable terms, guaranteeing humanity's security and opening trade routes. David had received very specific instructions about optimal negotiation strategies. But David wasn't thinking about optimal strategies. He was thinking about the intelligence reports he'd read during the war. About Empress Vashara leading her people through a succession crisis, a plague, and internal rebellions before humanity had even appeared. About how she'd personally led fleets in battle when she could have stayed safe. About how she'd negotiated peace with 3 neighboring species, while simultaneously reforming Kazhari law to be less draconian. About how every report described her as brilliant, ruthless, isolated, and utterly alone at the top of her empire. He was thinking about the communications chatter during the honor combat, when he'd targeted the Kazhari commander's ship. He'd heard Vashara's voice, distress when she thought her commander was dying. Not calculated concern over losing an asset, but genuine fear of losing someone she cared about. He was thinking about how she sat on that throne now, surrounded by nobles who showed her deference but not affection, respect but not warmth, feared rather than loved, obeyed rather than chosen. Power incarnate and utterly, devastatingly alone. David had always been terrible at making the smart choice when the right choice presented itself. He raised his arm and pointed directly at Empress Vashara. "I want her." The throne room exploded into chaos. Kazhari nobles erupted in clicking, buzzing vocalizations that the translator struggled to render. Outrage, shock, disbelief, all mixing into cacophony. Guards moved toward David, weapons beginning to charge, before Vashara raised one hand in a sharp gesture that froze everyone in place. "Explain yourself." Her voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. "Explain what you mean by this request." Her compound eyes were fixed on David with an intensity that would have been terrifying if it wasn't so mesmerizing. "I mean exactly what I said," David replied calmly. "My reward for winning the honor combat, I choose you, Her Majesty, Empress Vashara of the Kazhari." The nobles erupted again, louder this time. David caught fragments through the translation chaos. "Impossible. Insult to the throne. The human mocks us." An elderly Kazhari noble pushed forward, his antennae quivering with what David's hastily downloaded cultural briefing suggested was extreme agitation. "The victor's right has limits. The Empress is not property to be claimed. She is the throne, the law, the heart of our empire itself. This is not a valid request under any interpretation of the ancient law." "Actually," David said, keeping his voice level, "I downloaded and read the complete text of your ancient laws during the flight here. The victor's right states any reward within reason, with only 3 specific limitations." He ticked them off on his fingers. "Cannot demand the dissolution of the empire. Cannot require the breaking of previously sworn sacred oaths. Cannot demand something that physically does not exist." He looked directly at Vashara. "I'm not demanding the empire be dissolved. I'm not asking her to break any oaths she's sworn, and she definitely exists. So by the letter of your own law, my request is valid." The elderly noble's mandibles clicked in frustration. "You deliberately misunderstand the spirit of..." "The spirit of the law," David interrupted, "is that a victor may name their reward and the empire must honor it. I'm naming mine, Empress Vashara." Another noble stepped forward, younger and more aggressive, his chitinous plates decorated with military insignia that marked him as high-ranking. You ask for our empress as if she were a prize to be won, as if she were an object for your human desires. This is grotesque. Is it? David's voice was sharper now. Because from what I understand of Kazhari culture, arranged marriages between ruling families and conquered peoples aren't exactly uncommon. Half of your own nobility exists because of political marriages that sealed alliances or ended conflicts. He gestured around the room. How is this different? Those were political arrangements. The military noble sputtered. Strategic alliances between rulers and those they defeated or needed to align with, David finished. Exactly what this is. I defeated your commander in honor combat according to your own traditions. I could ask for land, resources, or technology. Instead, I'm asking for an alliance sealed the way your own culture has sealed alliances for centuries. He paused deliberately. Through marriage. The word hung in the air like a detonated bomb. Marriage. The nobles' outrage reached new heights. Several were calling for David's immediate execution. Ancient laws be damned. Others argued about legal precedents. A few looked genuinely confused, trying to determine if this was brilliant political maneuvering or complete insanity. Through it all, Empress Vashara had remained silent, her compound eyes never leaving David's face. Her antennae were angled in a way David couldn't fully interpret: shock, calculation, or something else entirely. Finally, she raised her hand again. Silence fell immediately. The absolute fear her simple gesture commanded told David everything about how her nobles saw her, as absolute authority to be obeyed instantly. You ask for marriage, Vashara said slowly, testing the word. To me, the Empress of the Kazhari Empire. Yes, your majesty. Why? The question was simple, but David heard layers beneath it. Not just why marriage, but why me? Not what do you gain politically, but what could you possibly want with me as a person? David took a breath. This was the moment where he either explained himself clearly or this all fell apart spectacularly. During the war, I read every intelligence report we had on you, watched every recording of your public addresses, studied your tactical decisions, your political reforms, your personal history. He saw her antennae twitch, surprise maybe, that he'd paid such attention. You've led your people through crisis after crisis, reformed laws that were causing suffering, personally led fleets when you didn't have to, risking yourself to protect your people. You're brilliant, dedicated, powerful. He paused, choosing his next words carefully, and utterly alone. Vashara's entire body went still. David pressed forward. I noticed that in all those intelligence reports there was never anyone close to you. No consort, no personal companions mentioned, no one you trusted with anything beyond professional duty. You're surrounded by people who fear you, who respect your power, who obey your commands. He gestured around the throne room. But no one who just chooses you, not the Empress, you. The throne room was absolutely silent now. The nobles had stopped objecting, caught off guard by this turn in the conversation. You know nothing of me, Vashara said, but her voice had lost some of its sharp edge. I know you lead alone because you think you have to. I know you're feared because you've had to be fearsome to survive. I know that power has isolated you in ways that winning every battle never could. David took a step closer, and the guards tensed but didn't move without orders. I'm not asking for the Empress as a prize. I'm asking if the person underneath all that power might want to be chosen for once, instead of just obeyed. Vashara's antennae were trembling now. David realized with shock that she might be crying, or whatever the Kazhari equivalent was. This is manipulation, she said, but there was no conviction behind the words. This is me being honest, David countered. Yes, I read your laws and found a loophole. Yes, this will create a political alliance that benefits both our peoples, but that's not why I chose this. He met her eyes, all of them, steadily. I chose this because I spent 18 months fighting against you, and the thing that struck me most wasn't your military power or tactical brilliance. It was that someone as capable as you, who's given everything to lead her people, has never had anyone stand beside her by choice rather than duty. His voice softened, and that seemed like the greatest tragedy of this entire war. The silence stretched. Vashara sat frozen on her throne, her entire court watching, waiting. David could feel his heart hammering, wondering if he just made the worst mistake of his life or somehow stumbled into the only right answer. Finally, Vashara spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "And if I refuse? Then I'll ask for mining rights to 3-star systems and trade agreements, and I'll go back to Earth having won a war and gained nothing that actually matters," David replied steadily. He smiled slightly. "But you won't refuse. You sound very certain." "I am certain, because I think you're as tired of being alone as I am of being just another soldier who got lucky. Because I think you want someone to choose you as much as I want to choose something real instead of politically optimal." He gestured at her antennae. "And because your antennae have been angled toward me this entire time, which according to my cultural briefings means you're interested even if you haven't admitted it yet." Several nobles gasped at David's boldness in referencing such intimate body language in public. But Vashara's mandibles shifted in what might have been the Kazhari equivalent of a smile. "You are either very brave or very foolish, human." "I've been told that before," David said, "usually right before I do something that works out improbably well." Vashara rose from her throne, and every noble in the room bowed reflexively. She descended the steps until she stood directly before David, towering over him. Kazhari were significantly taller than humans. Up close, he could see the intricate patterns on her chitinous plates, the way her compound eyes caught and refracted light in stunning complexity, the subtle movements of her antennae expressing emotions her voice didn't convey. "You ask for marriage," she said quietly, "an alliance between our peoples sealed in the ancient way. You claim to choose me not as empress but as Vashara, as myself. Yes, this will create complications beyond imagining. Political difficulties for both our peoples, cultural conflicts we cannot yet predict. Probably, you have no idea what you're asking for. That's never stopped me before." And then Vashara did something that shocked every noble in the throne room. She laughed. It was a strange sound, harmonics that the translator didn't even attempt to render into human speech, but it was genuine and surprised and somehow delighted. "Very well, Captain David Carter," Vashara said, her antennae angling in what David was learning meant pleased amusement. "I accept your request. Let it be witnessed by all present. You have claimed me as your reward, and I have accepted." She extended her primary manipulating appendage, the Kazhari equivalent of offering her hand. "We shall be bonded by ancient law and custom, for better or worse." David took her hand, the chitinous surface cool and smooth against his palm. "For better or worse," he agreed. And the throne room erupted into chaos once again. The immediate aftermath involved a lot of shouting in multiple languages, several near fights between nobles that guards had to break up, and 3 separate attempts to invoke obscure ancient laws that might somehow invalidate what had just happened. Through it all, Vashara remained beside David, and he noticed that her antennae stayed angled toward him, interested, curious, and perhaps a little amused by the chaos they'd created together. An emergency council session was called immediately. David found himself in an ornate side chamber with Vashara, several high-ranking nobles whose names he couldn't pronounce, and 3 beings who appeared to be legal scholars frantically consulting holographic displays of ancient texts. "This is unprecedented," one scholar said, his antennae twitching with visible agitation. "The victor's right has never been invoked for marriage to the throne itself. Technically," David pointed out, "I invoked it for marriage to Vashara, who happens to be empress. There's a distinction without meaningful difference," the military noble from earlier snapped. You ask for our empress, you ask for power over. I asked her, David corrected firmly, and she accepted. Everything else is just details we need to work out. Details that will reshape the political landscape of two species. Another noble interjected. Yes, Vashara spoke up, her voice carrying absolute authority that made everyone else fall silent. And that is my decision to make, not yours. The nobles looked like they wanted to argue but didn't quite dare. One of the older scholars, her chitinous plates marked with patterns indicating great age and wisdom, spoke more carefully. Your Majesty, forgive the directness, but we must understand the human's true intentions. Is this truly about personal choice, as he claims, or is this sophisticated political maneuvering to gain control over our empire? David expected Vashara to defend him, but instead she turned and looked at him directly, her compound eyes studying him with unsettling intensity. Yes, Captain Carter, explain your intentions clearly. Are you truly claiming to want me as a person, or is this clever strategy? She deserved honesty. They all did. Both, David said simply. The nobles reacted with outrage, but David continued before they could shout him down. Yes, this creates political alliance. Yes, it's strategically advantageous for both our peoples. I'm not stupid. I understand that marriage between human and Kazhari leadership could end this war permanently and create opportunities neither species would have alone. He looked directly at Vashara. But that's not why I asked. I asked because I read your history and saw someone who's given everything to lead and received nothing personal in return. Because I saw someone brilliant and powerful and utterly isolated by that power. His voice softened. Because I still think, that you deserve to be chosen as a person, not just obeyed as a ruler. Vashara's antennae trembled in what David was learning meant deep emotional response. You could have had any reward, she said quietly. Wealth beyond measure, territory, technological secrets that would advance your species by generations. Why this, why me? Because all of that is just things, David replied. Resources, power, advantage, they're all just things. They don't choose you back, they don't see you. He took a step closer to her, aware that every eye in the room was on them. I've spent the last 18 months fighting a war I didn't start, watching people die for political miscommunication, following orders from people who have never seen battle. I'm tired of just surviving, just following the smart tactical choice, just being another piece on someone else's board. His voice grew more intense. You asked if this is strategy or personal. It's both, and I won't insult you by pretending otherwise. But the strategic part isn't why I chose this, it's just what makes it possible. The personal part is why it matters. The room fell silent. Finally, one of the scholars spoke hesitantly. If we are to proceed with this unprecedented arrangement, there must be terms, contracts, clear understanding of what this marriage means politically and personally. Agreed, Vashara said. Draft the terms. The captain and I will review them together. She looked at David. You should understand what you're agreeing to. Kazhari marriage bonds are not merely symbolic. They involve actual biological connections, mediated through pheromone exchanges and neural linking that. I know, David interrupted. I read about that too. The bonding process, the pheromone compatibility requirements, the fact that Kazhari marriages create actual biochemical connections between partners. I know what I'm signing up for. Vashara's antennae angled sharply, surprised pleasure, David thought. And you still want this, knowing it will change you on a biological level. I still want this. You continue to surprise me, human. David, he corrected gently, if we're getting married, you should probably use my name. David, she repeated, testing the word. Her mandibles shifted and what he'd learned was her smile. And you may call me Vashara. Not your majesty or empress. If you choose me as a person, you should use my name. It was a small thing, but the noble's reaction suggested it was significant. Apparently, addressing the empress by her personal name wasn't done casually. Over the following days, the terms were negotiated, with the kind of intensity usually reserved for major treaty discussions. David learned exactly what he'd gotten himself into. Kazhari marriage wasn't a simple ceremony, but a multi-stage process involving biological compatibility testing, ritual exchanges, and ultimately a bonding process that would literally alter his brain chemistry to create a permanent connection with Vashara. Human medical experts were frantically consulted, brought in via secure communications from Earth to analyze whether the process would even work with human biology. Kazhari scientists explained the bonding in terms that made David's head spin: pheromone receptors, neural pathway modifications, biochemical feedback loops that would create a permanent awareness of each other's emotional states. The conclusion: it would work, but it would be irreversible. Once bonded, they would be connected in ways that transcended simple emotional attachment. They would sense each other's emotional states, feel physical distance as psychologically uncomfortable, and be biochemically driven toward each other's presence. It's not mind control, a Kazhari scientist explained carefully. You'll maintain independent thoughts and complete free will, but you'll be aware of each other, constantly. Some humans might find that claustrophobic. Some Kazhari have refused bonding for exactly the same reason, Vashara added. They were in her private chambers now, discussing the implications away from the court's scrutiny. It's permanent, David. There's no dissolving this bond once it forms. You should be absolutely certain before we proceed. David considered this carefully. A permanent connection to another being, irreversible changes to his brain chemistry. Spending the rest of his life psychologically linked to someone he'd known for less than a week. The smart choice would be to back out, to accept that this was interesting in theory but insane in practice. But David had never been good at smart choices. "I'm certain," he said. "Why?" Vashara asked, and there was genuine confusion in her voice. "You don't know me, not really. We've had a handful of conversations. You've read intelligence reports, but those are facts, not understanding. How can you be certain about something this permanent with someone you barely know?" "Because I know the important things," David said. "I know you've led your people through impossible crises with wisdom and courage. I know you reformed laws that were causing harm even though it made you enemies. I know you personally led fleets to protect your people when you could have stayed safe." He met her eyes. "And I know that when I pointed at you and said I wanted you as my reward, your first reaction wasn't anger or calculation. It was surprise. Like no one had ever wanted you as a person before. Like being chosen rather than obeyed was so foreign you didn't know how to process it." Vashara's antennae drooped slightly, sadness, David thought, or perhaps recognition of painful truth. "You see too much human." "David," he corrected gently. "And yes, probably. I've always been too observant for my own good. It's why I'm a decent pilot. I see patterns others miss. It's also why I make terrible decisions that work out improbably well. Such as choosing the alien empress you've been fighting for 18 months as your victory reward. Exactly like that." Vashara's mandibles shifted in her smile. "You are either the bravest being I have ever encountered or the most foolish. Can it be both?" She laughed, that harmonic sound David was learning to love even though the translator couldn't render it properly. "Perhaps it can be both." She moved closer, and David noticed she was adjusting her height. Kazhari could compress their leg segments to reduce their stature when they chose. It was apparently an intimate gesture, bringing herself closer to his eye level. "I should tell you," she said quietly, "that you're correct. About me being alone, about power isolating me, about never being chosen as a person rather than obeyed as a ruler." Her antennae drooped further. "I have been empress for 20 years. In that time I have had advisors, allies, subjects, enemies, but never someone who simply chose me, who wanted Vashara rather than the throne." "That seems like a terrible way to live," David said softly. "It is the way of power. Those who rule must accept isolation as the price of authority." "Or," David suggested, Maybe that's just something people tell themselves to justify leaving leaders alone when they shouldn't be. He reached out slowly, giving Vashara time to move away if she wanted. When she didn't, he took her hand, her primary manipulating appendage. The chitinous surface was cool and surprisingly smooth. You don't have to be alone anymore. That's what this means. Not political alliance or strategic advantage, though those matter too. It means you have someone who chose you, who will keep choosing you. Vashara looked at their joined hands, her antennae expressing emotions David couldn't fully interpret, but that felt profound and significant. The bonding will change you, she warned. Physically, neurologically, you'll never be fully human again in some ways. Are you truly prepared for that? Are you prepared to have someone close enough to sense your emotions? David countered. Someone who will know when you're troubled or afraid or lonely, even when you're projecting strength to your court. That is deeply concerning, Vashara admitted. I have spent 20 years maintaining perfect composure. The thought of someone sensing what lies beneath that facade. Terrifying, David agreed. For both of us, but maybe also exactly what we both need. They stood there in her private chambers, alien and human holding hands across species barriers, contemplating changes neither could fully predict or understand. Outside, their respective peoples were probably panicking about the political implications. Inside, two beings who'd been enemies days ago were choosing something neither fully understood but both desperately needed. When? Vashara asked finally. When do we proceed with the bonding ceremony? Whenever you're ready, David said. There's no rush. We can take time tomorrow, Vashara decided firmly. If we are doing this, we do it before I lose courage, before political reality intrudes too far, before either of us becomes too sensible to proceed. David grinned. That's the spirit. Make terrible decisions quickly before wisdom intervenes. Is that human philosophy? It's my personal philosophy. It served me surprisingly well so far. Vashara's laughter filled the chamber, and David realized it was the first time he'd heard her laugh without reservation or political calculation. Just genuine, surprised joy. Very well, David Carter, she said. Tomorrow The bonding ceremony took place in a secured medical chamber deep within the palace, far from prying eyes and political complications. Ceremony was perhaps overstating it. The process was more medical procedure with ritual elements woven throughout. David lay on a platform designed to accommodate cross-species medical care, while Kazhari scientists prepared the biochemical compounds that would initiate the bonding process. Vashara occupied her own platform beside him, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked genuinely nervous. Her antennae were flat against her head, the Kazhari equivalent of anxious tension. Having second thoughts? David asked. Numerous ones, Vashara admitted freely. This is insanity. We barely know each other. We were enemies mere days ago. This violates every principle of measured decision-making I've cultivated over 20 years of rule. Want to back out? Absolutely not. She turned her compound eyes toward him. You. Terrified, David admitted cheerfully. But also certain this is right, which is a very confusing combination of feelings. Welcome to every significant life decision, Vashara said, and her mandibles shifted in what might have been a smile. The lead scientist, an elderly Kazhari whose name David still couldn't properly pronounce, approached with a device that looked like equal parts medical scanner and mystical artifact. We will begin with comprehensive compatibility testing, the scientist explained. This will determine if your biochemistries can successfully bond without rejection or harmful side effects. The testing took over an hour. David's blood was analyzed, his brain activity mapped, his hormone levels measured and compared against Kazhari physiological standards that scientists were frantically adapting for human biology. Throughout the process, Vashara watched with an intensity David could feel even without the bond they were about to create. Finally, the lead scientist made an announcement that sounded genuinely surprised. Compatibility is extraordinarily high, higher than many Kazhari pairings, in fact. The captain's brain chemistry appears to have unusual receptor flexibility that will facilitate bonding far more easily than we initially projected. Is that good? David asked. It is unprecedented, the scientist responded carefully. But yes, good. It means the bonding will be stable and strong, perhaps stronger than typical. You may experience the connection more intensely than standard Kazhari pairs. Too late to back out now, David said, looking at Vashara. Far too late, she agreed. Through the growing connection he could almost feel forming, he sensed her mix of nervousness and determination. The actual bonding process involved carefully controlled exposure to synthesized pheromones combined with precisely targeted neural stimulation. David breathed in compounds that smelled like metal and flowers, and something he had no reference point for. Scientists attached small devices to specific points on his skull that sent gentle pulses of stimulation into targeted brain regions. Beside him, Vashara underwent the same process. At first, nothing seemed to happen. Then, gradually, David became aware of something at the very edge of his consciousness. A presence that wasn't his own thoughts but wasn't intrusive either, more like sensing someone else in a dark room without seeing them directly. The presence grew stronger, more defined. David realized he could feel emotions that weren't his own, nervousness mixed with anticipation, fear combined with hope, and underneath everything, a loneliness so profound it made his chest physically ache. Vashara's loneliness. 20 years of isolation carried like a weight she'd never been able to set down. But there was something else too. As David sensed her emotions, he realized she was sensing his. Through the forming bond, he felt her surprise at what she found in his mind. Genuine care mixed with attraction, determination combined with uncertainty, and his own loneliness that mirrored hers in different ways. Two beings who'd been isolated in completely different circumstances, now suddenly and intimately aware of each other's emotional landscape. The bonding intensified. David could sense more now, not thoughts exactly, but impressions. Vashara's fierce protectiveness toward her people, her exhaustion from years of bearing impossible burdens alone, her surprise that anyone would choose to share those burdens. And she sensed him, his impulsiveness that masked deeper certainty, his tendency to see patterns and connections others missed, his absolute conviction that choosing her was right even if he couldn't fully articulate why. She sensed his attraction to her strength, his fascination with her mind, his desire to be chosen as much as to choose. The bond settled into place like a key turning in a well-fitted lock, a click of recognition, of completion, of two separate beings becoming permanently connected across impossible species barriers. David opened his eyes. He hadn't realized he'd closed them, and immediately looked at Vashara. She was looking back, and through the bond he felt her wonder, her fear, her joy, her uncertainty, all mixed together in a way that was utterly overwhelming and somehow perfectly right. "I can feel you," she whispered. "Your emotions, your presence. You're there in my mind and I'm in yours, and this is intense," David finished. "But not bad, strange, but definitely not bad." "You feel lonely too," Vashara said, and there was pain in her voice. "As lonely as I am. We are two isolated beings trying to bridge an impossible gap." "We're lonely," David corrected gently, past tense. "Because I can feel you too now, and you're not alone anymore. Neither of us are." Through the bond, he sensed her emotional response. A surge of relief so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him, mixed with fear that this might somehow be temporary, hope that it was real, and growing affection that mirrored his own. The scientists were monitoring the bond formation with equipment David didn't understand, making notes and checking readings. The lead scientist made approving sounds. "The bond is stable, strong. Perhaps stronger than any pairing I have personally witnessed in 40 years of practice. You are now connected in ways that will persist for the remainder of your lives." "No backing out now," David said. "No backing out now. Vashara agreed, and through the bond he felt her satisfaction, her contentment, her nervous joy at this permanent connection. The following days were an adjustment period that tested them both in ways neither had anticipated. The bond was constant. David was always aware of Vashara's emotional state, and she was always aware of his. It was like having someone else's feelings running as background noise in his mind, except it wasn't noise at all. It was connection. When Vashara was in court sessions managing political crises that followed their unprecedented marriage, David felt her stress and frustration even when he was rooms away. When David was navigating tense conversations with human representatives frantically trying to understand what he'd done, Vashara sensed his amusement at their panic mixed with his own uncertainty. They learned to navigate this new reality together, developing techniques to maintain some mental privacy. The bond didn't transmit thoughts directly, just emotions and general impressions, but even that could be overwhelming without practice. Vashara taught David how to create subtle mental barriers, not to block the bond but to modulate its intensity. David taught Vashara that it was actually okay to feel her emotions instead of constantly suppressing them for political purposes. He was going to sense them through the bond anyway, so pretending they didn't exist was pointless. "This is strange," Vashara said one evening as they sat together in their private chambers, their chambers now, officially and irreversibly. "I have spent 20 years maintaining perfect control, never showing weakness or uncertainty. Now you know every time I'm afraid or doubtful. And you know every time I'm completely out of my depth, which is basically constantly," David pointed out. "Fair exchange." "You are not afraid often," Vashara observed. Through the bond she could sense the truth of his emotions. "I sense your uncertainty, yes, but rarely actual fear. How do you manage that?" "I spent 18 months in a war where death could come at any moment," David replied quietly. "You learn to accept uncertainty without fear, or you break under the weight of it. I chose acceptance." Through the bond, Vashara sensed the deeper truth, the scars that experience had left, the trauma David carried from months of constant combat, his own losses and loneliness from the war. She'd known intellectually that the human she'd been fighting had suffered too, but feeling the echo of it through their bond made it real in ways information never could. "We are both damaged," she said quietly. "Both isolated in different ways before this. Both carrying burdens we thought we had to bear alone." "We're isolated," David corrected again as he had so many times. "Past tense, we're bonded now. Your burdens are mine, mine are yours. That's what this means." "That is precisely what terrifies me," Vashara admitted. "I am accustomed to carrying everything alone. The thought of actually sharing burdens, actually depending on someone else, that is terrifying," David agreed. "For both of us, but maybe that's what we both need, to be terrified together instead of alone." Over the following weeks, they learned to work together in ways that surprised both of them. David wasn't trained in Kazhari politics or familiar with the complexities of managing an interstellar empire, but he offered perspectives Vashara hadn't considered. His pattern recognition abilities, honed through combat, translated surprisingly well to political strategy. Vashara taught David the intricate dance of Kazhari governance, the careful balance of noble houses, the ancient protocols that couldn't be ignored, the cultural context behind decisions that seemed arbitrary to human eyes. When human and Kazhari representatives met to formalize peace terms and establish formal diplomatic relations, David and Vashara presented an absolutely united front. The negotiations were complicated by their unprecedented bond. Some humans saw it as David being compromised or controlled. Some Kazhari saw it as Vashara weakening herself through attachment to a former enemy. But both leaders discovered that having someone who literally shared your emotional state made deception in negotiations essentially pointless. Trust was built faster when both sides knew their leaders were bonded at a biochemical level, incapable of hiding their true feelings from each other. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" Vashara asked one night. They were standing on the observation platform of her chambers, watching stars that neither species had known existed until recently. "Not just me, but this. The peace, the alliance, the bridge between our species. I wanted you," David said simply. "The rest is just an incredibly valuable bonus." Through the bond, Vashara sensed the absolute truth of it. He really had chosen her primarily as a person, with political benefits being genuinely secondary. It still amazed her. "No one has ever chosen me before," she said quietly. "Not as Vashara, only as Empress. Even now, I struggle to believe you truly wanted me rather than what I represent." "Then let me prove it again." David extended his hand. "The observation deck has no political significance, no strategic value. Come stargazing with me, not as Empress, not as political ally, just as Vashara. Let me choose you again here, where it means nothing to anyone but us." Vashara took his hand, and through their bond David felt her emotions surge. Surprise, pleasure, deep affection, and underneath everything, a desperate hope that this was real, that someone truly had chosen her for herself. They stood together watching stars neither species had catalogued, bonded across barriers that were supposedly insurmountable, sharing emotions that transcended any translation technology. "I am still uncertain about this," Vashara admitted. "About us, about whether this can truly work long-term, about whether I deserve to be chosen like this." "I'm uncertain about most things," David replied honestly, "but I'm absolutely certain about you, about this, about choosing you every single day for the rest of our lives." Through the bond, she felt his certainty, unwavering and absolute despite his admission of uncertainty about everything else. The paradox was perfectly honest and quintessentially him. "You are a strange being, David Carter. You're pretty strange yourself, Vashara. That's why this works." She laughed, and the sound carried harmonics of pure joy that resonated through their bond, feeding back to amplify both their happiness in a biochemical loop of shared contentment. It wasn't perfect. They still had cultural misunderstandings, still struggled with the constant awareness of each other's emotions, still faced political opposition from factions who viewed their bond as weakness or betrayal of their respective species. But they faced it together. Two beings who'd been isolated by power and circumstance, now connected in ways that transcended species and politics, and all the logical reasons why this absolutely shouldn't work. Sometimes the worst strategic decision is the only right personal choice. Sometimes choosing someone who's never been chosen as a person is the most revolutionary act possible. And sometimes, just sometimes, love really can bridge the impossible gap between worlds. 6 months after the bonding ceremony, David stood in the same throne room where everything had begun. The space looked different now, less hostile, though no less impressive. Kazhari nobles who'd initially opposed the match had gradually, grudgingly accepted it as both David and Vashara proved their partnership actually worked. The occasion was a formal celebration marking the official peace treaty between the Kazhari Empire and humanity, a treaty made possible in large part by the unprecedented bond between their leaders. David wore hybrid formal attire, part human military dress uniform and part Kazhari ceremonial garb. It looked ridiculous by the standards of either culture, but somehow appropriate for someone who existed between both worlds now. Vashara stood beside him, her chitinous plates polished to gleaming perfection, the crown of her office resting on her head. Through their bond, David felt her mixture of pride and nervousness. This was a significant moment for both their peoples. Representatives from dozens of human colonies and Kazhari territories filled the throne room. What had been a space of hostility 6 months ago now hosted the largest gathering of humans and Kazhari working together in history. The formal speeches were given. Earth's ambassador spoke about the tragedy of war born from misunderstanding and the hope of peace built on genuine connection. A Kazhari elder discussed the ancient laws that had made this alliance possible and the unexpected wisdom of traditions maintained across generations. But the moment that mattered most came when Vashara stepped forward to address the assembled crowd. 6 months ago, a human stood in this room and made what appeared to be an impossible request, she began, her voice carrying through the perfect acoustics. He asked for me, not for territory or resources or technology, not for political advantage or military alliance, for me. Through their bond, David felt her emotions, vulnerability mixed with strength, fear combined with certainty. I accepted because I recognized something in him that I had never encountered before. Someone who chose me not for what I represented, but for who I was. Someone who saw past the Empress to Vashara underneath. She turned to look at David directly. In doing so, he taught both our peoples something crucial, that true strength comes not from isolation but from connection. That power means nothing if it leaves you utterly alone. That being chosen as a person, rather than obeyed as a symbol, is perhaps the greatest gift anyone can receive. The crowd was silent, listening intently. Our bond, this biochemical connection that links us permanently, has made deception between our peoples nearly impossible. When the Empress of the Kazhari and a human representative are literally unable to hide their true feelings from each other, trust becomes inevitable rather than aspirational. She smiled, her mandibles shifting in that expression David had grown to love. But more importantly, our bond has shown that what seemed impossible, connection across species barriers, understanding across fundamental differences, is not only possible but transformative. We do not love despite our differences. We love because we chose to see each other truly, differences and all. Through their bond, David sent waves of support and affection. Vashara's antennae angled toward him, a gesture of intimate recognition that the entire assembly could witness. Later, in the privacy of their chambers, after all the formal celebrations had concluded and the representatives had departed, David and Vashara finally had a moment alone. Vashara removed her crown and set it on its stand, her antennae drooping slightly with exhaustion. "That was intense," she said. "You were amazing," David replied. "The speech, the way you framed our bond as template rather than anomaly, brilliant." I meant every word. She moved to the observation platform, and David joined her. Together, they watched the lights of the capital city below, a city that now hosted both Kazhari and human residents working together on joint projects. "Do you ever regret it?" Vashara asked quietly. "That day in the throne room when you pointed at me instead of asking for something sensible." David considered the question seriously. Through their bond, Vashara could sense his emotions, but she'd asked aloud, so he answered the same way. "Never, not once, not even for a second. Even though it changed you fundamentally. Even though you're bonded to me in ways you can never undo. Even though you gave up your purely human identity to become something between worlds. Especially because of all that," David said firmly. "I didn't lose my human identity. I expanded it, added something new rather than replacing something old." He pulled her closer, their bond singing with shared affection. "And I got you. The brilliant, powerful, occasionally terrifying Empress who'd been alone for 20 years. Who's now my partner, my bonded mate, my best friend who I'm biochemically incapable of lying to." You make it sound romantic when you describe our inability to deceive each other. It is romantic. Enforced honesty means enforced intimacy. Can't hide from someone who feels your emotions. Vashara's mandibles shifted in her smile. "You are still strange, even after 6 months of bonding. And you're still adjusting to not being alone, even though you don't have to be anymore." Through the bond, he felt her acknowledge the truth of that. She was still learning how to share burdens, still discovering what it meant to have genuine partnership rather than just subordinates or advisors. "I love you," she said simply. "I'm not certain when it happened, somewhere between you pointing at me dramatically and now. But I do. I love you too," David replied. "Probably started the moment you laughed at my terrible decision-making and accepted anyway." They stood together on the observation platform, bonded across species barriers, sharing emotions that needed no translation. Below them, their two species were learning to coexist, building something new from the ashes of misunderstanding and war. Above them, stars wheeled through patterns neither species had fully mapped, vast and mysterious and full of possibilities. And between them, a bond that had started as the most improbable choice imaginable had become the foundation of something neither could have predicted, but both cherished absolutely. In the throne room, after winning a war, David had pointed at power incarnate and claimed her as his reward. Everyone had thought it was about conquest, about possession, about clever political maneuvering. But it was simpler and more profound than that. It was about choosing someone who'd never been chosen as a person, about refusing to accept that power meant inevitable isolation, about seeing worth where others saw only danger or untouchability, and about discovering that sometimes the most revolutionary act is pointing at someone and saying, "I choose you, not what you represent, you." David had made that choice. Vashara had accepted it, and in doing so, they'd rewritten everything. Not through conquest or manipulation, but through the simple, terrifying, absolutely sincere act of wanting someone for who they were rather than what they symbolized. The Kazhari Empire and humanity built their alliance, signed their treaties, began their complicated dance of two civilizations learning to coexist. But the real change, the one that mattered most, happened in the bond between two beings who chose each other when logic said they shouldn't. David had won a war and gained a reward beyond any measure. Vashara had found something she'd never dared hope for. They were bonded, connected, permanently intertwined, and neither would have chosen any other outcome. What happens now? David asked, echoing a question from months ago. Now, Vashara said, we keep learning, keep building, keep choosing each other every day. Sounds perfect. Sounds terrifying and uncertain, and absolutely worth it. But through their bond, they shared emotions that transcended words, love and partnership, and the profound recognition of two beings who'd found each other in the most impossible circumstances imaginable. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemy. Sometimes it's choosing to love them instead. And sometimes, just sometimes, the most dangerous thing anyone can do is point at power incarnate and say, "I choose you. Not what you represent, you." David made that choice, and every day since he chose it again, and would keep choosing it for all the days to come.